What does Legacy look like with MH3? My name is Matt, and my crippling vice is data analysis. We're going to go over the impact of Modern Horizons 3 on the Legacy format and highlight some of the top performing decks and some spicy lists that have come out of the new metagame. Modern Horizons 3 hit Legacy on June 11th, with the first Legacy challenge on June 12th. I am recording this on June 25th, the day after the BNR update, where we saw no changes to the format. This script and all the data is from prior to that announcement, which, to be honest, I didn't realize was happening until it happened. But thankfully for my workflow, all the info is still up to date because no changes to the metagame were made. Or no changes to the format, rather. I have some thoughts on the state of Legacy and possible bans at the end of the video, which I think are still relevant after the announcement. So let's jump into the metagame and the results. In terms of the overall metagame, I missed pulling the lists from one preliminary event on June 19th before WotC pulled down the decklist page. Between June 11th and 19th, there were a total of 311 players in non-league events, obviously barring the one prelim that I missed. There were 5 Challenge 32s with a combined total of 221 players, one Challenge 64 that had 76 players, and then I caught the one prelim that had 14 players. There are lots of new MH3 cards being played, but the metagame itself is not so different from what it was before MH3 came out. Dimir Rescaminator is still the format's top dog, representing just over 18% of the field, followed by Grixis Delver, Bird Breakfast, Classic Scam, and the new Necro Dominance deck. Let's take a quick look at the top 3 decks and their new inclusions. Dimir Rescaminator remains relatively unchanged, with the exception of many players choosing to play Psychic Frog in place of Orcish Bowmasters or Delphi Voidwalker. Prior to MH3, a plurality of Dimir Rescaminator lists had moved from Orcish Bowmasters to Delphi Voidwalkers, probably to try and gain an edge in the increasingly prevalent mirror matches. Psychic Frog is a quite powerful card. The closest analog in recent memory is Dreadhorde Arcanist, a card that was widely played in Delver decks and was eventually banned. Arcanist let you flash back 1 mana spells for free when it attacked, while Frog draws you a card when it hits a player or a planeswalker. Both of these cards allow you to run away with the game when unchecked, meaning that they both play really well with Daze. You play one of them, you protect it with Daze, you hit your opponent, you get card advantage, you snowball, your opponent loses. I don't think that Frog is quite as good as Arcanist is, I could be wrong, but it's certainly strong, and I'm very glad I picked up my set in paper. Psychic Frog must be unblocked to deal damage and draw a card, but it's easier to connect with than its 1/2 stat line might suggest. Each of its activated abilities make it very difficult to interact with in combat, the first of which being the ability to discard a card and put a +1/+1 counter on the Frog at instant speed. Obviously, this has synergy with the reanimation package in Dimir Rescaminator, allowing you to discard Atraxa or Archon if either one is drawn. However, even without that synergy, this ability is not to be discounted. It can basically always win in combat if you need it to. An example from a match that I recently played was when I was playing Bird Breakfast. I had a resolved Nadu, and I blocked my opponent's Frog with the intention of either killing it or trading for 3 cards out of their hand. They discarded 3 cards and ate my Nadu, which ended up being the correct call for them as I was unable to answer the now much larger Frog. The last ability, exiling 3 cards from the graveyard to give it flying, is also really potent. It allows the Frog to attack in the air, and it's much harder to block, without necessarily having to invest any meaningful resources. In Scam and Rescaminator mirrors, this exile effect is extremely effective against the opponent casting Reanimate or Animate Dead on a target in your graveyard, because you can exile the card in response. While this effect can have anti-synergy with wanting to cast Murktide Regent on a subsequent turn, it also has beneficial synergy once Murktide is already in play, allowing you to grow the Murktide while making your freak Frog fly. The new Grixis Delver deck is really similar to the Temur and Grixis Delver decks from before MH3. We just spoke at length about Psychic Frog, but it's found a home here, replacing Bowmasters as a 4 of in the main deck. The removal suite's a little bit different now as well. Most players have removed the Molten Collapse, replacing it with Unholy Heat and sometimes a copy of Pyroblast. Psychic Frog, like I said, has strong similarities to the now banned Dreadhorde Arcanist. It has some notable differences as well, but it has the same ability to snowball advantage every turn that it stays on board. Dreadhorde Arcanist flashes back a card when it attacks, which is easier to enable than Psychic Frog drawing a card when it deals damage to an opponent or their planeswalkers. Dreadhorde Arcanist doesn't have any built-in evasion or ability to provide a significant clock on its own, while flashing back removal spells or Lightning Bolt can ensure that it doesn't die in combat or burn the opponent out. By contrast, Psychic Frog can fly if needed, and the discard effect can potentially win any combat and then be a larger threat to clock the opponent with. Psychic Frog is a card that fits perfectly into Delver tempo decks that are aiming to get on board and ride the wave to victory, snowballing advantage along the way. Bird Breakfast is a new take on a classic archetype, Cephalid Breakfast. Nadu Winged Wisdom is a 3/4 flyer for 3 mana with the following static ability. Creatures you control have, whenever this creature becomes the target of a spell or ability, reveal the top card of your library. If it's a land card, put it onto the battlefield. Otherwise, put it into your hand. This ability triggers only twice per turn. This is a lot of text, and on my first read, I didn't quite click for me how the ability would fully work in practice. Basically, each creature you control, including Nadu, will draw you a card each time it's targeted up to twice per turn. If you draw land this way, it goes into play. Untapped unless the land specifies otherwise, but nobody in Legacy plays tapped lands really. This is a long way of saying that the impact of Nadu is that when combined with Nomad's Encore or Shuko, you get to draw 2 cards per creature per turn and potentially explore multiple times. Call me Bertoncini, because I'm going to answer 2 explorers. Because the lands come into play untapped, it's possible but non-deterministic to play additional creatures and continue to draw additional cards, potentially even your entire deck. In some dedicated lists, there are additional cards like Field of the Dead that can power this up. In Modern, I think that people are playing, I think it's Springheart Nantuko. The reality is that in Legacy, drawing 4 to 6 cards and potentially putting some number of lands into play is game-winning on its own. The Nadu portion of the combo also doesn't use the graveyard, dodging hate aimed at the other half, the Cephalid Illusionist part of the combo. Nadu functions as an additional combo piece alongside Cephalid Illusionist while also being a standalone threat that can apply decent pressure. Assuming it resolves, Nadu will almost always be a 2-for-1 if the opponent spends a removal spell on it, as you'll get a trigger and draw a card. The only way that I can think of off the top of my head to answer it in a 1-for-1 manner is with something like Shieldred's Edict. Outside of these 3 top decks, the remainder of the metagame is comprised of classic Dimir Scam, the new Turbo Necro Dominance deck, Eldrazi Stompy, 12 Post, Moon Stompy, and Oops All Spells. There's a large smattering of decks below the 3% threshold, which is to be expected with so many new brewing options in MH3. Moving on to the Challenge 32 metagame. Out of the 5 Challenge 32s with a combined total of 221 players, Dimir Scaminator was nearly 20% of the field with 43 copies played. A mixture of Psychic Frog, Orcish Bowmasters, and Dauthi Voidwalkers were played in the 2-drop slot, depending on player preference or possibly maybe due to card availability. Frog was the most played of the 2-drops, with Dauthi being played a little bit less than that, and Bowmasters being the least played of the 2-drops. Grixis Delver was the second most played deck, just over 7.5% of the field, with Classic Scam coming in at 7.25-ish. Bird Breakfast was just under 6%, followed by 12 Post at 5.5%. Eldrazi Stompy was 5% of the field, with Necro at 4.5% and Moon Stompy at 4%. Dedicated Reanimator and Green-White X Depths were each in the 3 to 4% range. There were lots of other decks that represented less than 3% of the metagame, but there were way too many to go through here. Before we look at the results, I want to highlight the new Turbo Necro Dominance deck. Coming in at 4.5% of the field, it's a turn 1 combo deck featuring the new version of Necropotence, Necro Dominance. I think this archetype was pioneered by Tony Scapone, but I could be mistaken on that. Necro Dominance is a 3-mana enchantment that limits your hand size to 5 and has the effect, at the beginning of your end step, you may pay any amount of life. If you do, draw that many cards. Notably, it also has a replacement effect that prevents any cards or tokens from entering your graveyard, exiling them instead. It also skips your draw step, so you only get cards when you pay life to Necrodominance. I think obviously this is a powerful effect, but it requires some building around in order to take full advantage of this card draw effect. The combo in the deck involves resolving Necrodominance, moving towards your end step, and paying roughly 19 life to draw hopefully 19 cards, and then winning after drawing 19 is usually relatively trivial. Born Upon a Wind allows you to cast spells at instant speed for the rest of the turn. This is enabled by Spirit Guides and Manamorphose to filter into blue mana at instant speed. Once Born Upon a Wind has resolved, the deck then wins with Tendrils of Agony, either drawn naturally or tutored with Beseech the Mirror. Beseech the Mirror also allows you to find Necrodominance much more often, increasing the likelihood of a turn 1 Necro. The deck plays an interaction suite consisting of Chancellor of the Annex and Pact of Negation. Each is card and mana efficient when protecting a same turn kill. Valakut Awakening is another important supporting piece here, allowing you to dig even deeper into the deck if the draw 19 was not sufficient in finding enough black mana or a kill condition. This deck is super exciting and pretty cool. I really want to give it a shot, but I haven't had a chance yet, so if you have, let me know how it feels. Another new sort of deck, Eldrazi Stompy, has been popular since the release of MH3. We've seen a couple different splash colors in Eldrazi Stompy, but the green splash has been the most played of these variants, with red being the next one. The biggest advantage of Eldrazi when compared to other Stompy decks is that it is the best at taking advantage of soul lands. This is for sort of two reasons. The first being that the deck has access to nearly twice as many soul lands in Eldrazi Temple and Eye of Ugin, and I suppose you could also play the new one that got printed, I don't remember what it's called, but nobody is right now. With Eye having the potential to effectively generate more than 2 mana in a single turn, where you can cast multiple Eldrazi where the cost reduction effect impacts each individual card cast. The other big advantage of Eldrazi is that almost all the threats cost exclusively colorless mana. This removes the requirement to play cards like Chrome Mox or Lotus Petal to generate the mana for something like Magus of the Moon. This is a very high degree of consistency and allows the mana advantage of soul lands to stack. Notable new cards being included in these lists are It That Heralds the End, Devourer of Destiny, Kozilek's Command, and Glaring Fleshraker. The green splash lists also get access to Sowing Mycospawn. Sowing Mycospawn is a pretty cool card as well. The other lists are either fully colorless or include a red splash for Eldrazi Linebreaker. Looking at the results of the 6-round Challenge 32s, I'm going to examine X2 or better as a proxy for general performance. 32.5% of the overall field finished the challenges with a record of 4-2 or better, meaning that this is the benchmark for an average performance. Dimir Scaminator overperformed like crazy. 20 of the 43 pilots, a whopping 46.5%, finished their tournaments at 4-2 or better. This is honestly an absurd result for a deck representing nearly 20% of the field. To put this in perspective, this is nearly 40% better than the expected result. If we assume that each pilot played out every single round, an assumption which is honestly verifiably false but provides a conservative win rate estimate, we see that Scaminator had a win rate of 54.25%. When in reality, many of these players drop once they reach a record of X2 or X3 early in the tournament, meaning that the true win rate is honestly likely much higher than that. Basically, this number is reached by assuming that any result by Scaminator is that they played out all their rounds and that any result that didn't result in a win was a result of a loss and not due to a match being played because the player dropped from the tournament. The wild thing about this performance is that it's the top most played deck, making up nearly as much metagame as the next 3 most played decks combined. The next 3 most decks made up just over 20%, this makes up just under 20%. People are gunning to beat this deck and are still not succeeding at it on average, which is, I'm kind of speechless, to be honest. It's pretty crazy. Moving on, Grixis Delver performed slightly better than expected, while Classic Scam performed poorly. Bird Breakfast had the best result outside of Dimir Scaminator and Green-White X Depths. 12 Post had some top finishes and some bottom finishes, averaging out to sort of meet expectations. Eldrazi Stompy performed well overall, but the other new and popular deck in this range, Necro, underperformed. Moon Stompy was right around the expected result, and Dedicated Reanimator had a solid result. I just mentioned Green-White X Steps, but it retains a strong performance, as it seems to be one of the few decks with a strong Dimir Scaminator matchup. While not a large metagame presence, this second place Ruby Storm list is worth looking at. It's a fully non-reserved list deck. Ruby Storm has taken advantage of 2 new tools. Vexing Bauble, which functions similarly to Defense Grid in this deck, but without the downside of duplicate draws being dead, and it can prevent the opponents from using Force, Daze, and Grief. Ral Monsoon Mage is the other new tool. It provides the same effect as Ruby Medallion, and while it is more vulnerable to creature removal, it has some significant upside. Ral functions as a cost reducer and a payoff spell all in one. It reduces mana costs and helps to generate additional mana with rituals, Manamorphose, and makes Reckless Impulse effects much more efficient. Then, once you've cast 6 or more spells, you can elect to flip Ral and immediately use his -8 ability. It's a coin flip, so you gotta sort of wait until you find a coin flip when you want to use it, but generally speaking, you'll be able to. Ral's -8 lets you exile the top 8 cards of your deck and cast instants and sorceries among them without paying their mana costs. This is an effect that is obviously powerful enough to end the game on the spot in most situations. It doesn't really work well with Vexing Bauble, but because of the wording on the ability, you can choose to exile the cards, then if you want to sacrifice your Vexing Bauble, you can, and then you can cast the spells. I think typically this is a point in the spell chain where the opponent having a Force, Daze, or even a Mindbreak Trap is unlikely to save them. 12 Post took down the Challenge 64 on June 16th, and this list is relatively representative of the Post decks we've seen thus far. MH3 introduced many new cards that are being slotted into this deck. Disruptor Flute has replaced Pithy Needle as a tool to protect Cloudposts from Wasteland, and while it is less efficient, it is a much more flexible tool and has a higher impact than Needle does. Vexing Bauble is here to both impact fast combo with Artifact mana trying to slow them down, and it protects the Cloudpost deck from Force of Will and Daze. Each of these tools have utility beyond the first copy drawn, with Flute being able to tax the opponent out of casting key spells, and duplicate Baubles can be sacrificed to redraw. Sowing Mycospawn is being played here, filling a similar role as in the Eldrazi Stompy decks. It ramps and disrupts the opponent's mana. Notably, we see a Singleton Wasteland as a tool to fetch with Mycospawn to enable a double uncounterable land destruction effect when Mycospawn is kicked. The mana base has also been upgraded. Planar Nexus functions as an untapped locus, powering up Cloudpost, and a new addition, Urza's Tower. It also has the ability to filter colorless mana into green for a small quantity of green spells in the deck. This new version of 12 Post is definitely worth keeping an eye on. There are other notable cards seeing some play that I want to quickly go over. D&T has a couple new toys, White Orchid Phantom and Felia Exuberant Shepherd. White Orchid Phantom is awesome. It's non-basic land hate and an efficient body all in one. It combos with Flickerwisp, Yorion, and Felia. Felia is a flash threat that has a lot of utility when combined with the ETB triggers that we find on so many of D&T's threats. Harbinger of the Tides is a cool tool for Merfolk and other proactive creature decks to combat greedy mana bases and land strategies. Nethergoyf is seeing some play in Delver and classic scam lists as a recursive and efficient threat. Speaking of Goyfs, Barrowgoyf has also been played in small quantities as a post-board threat in Doomsday and in some Dimir Scam main decks. In the sort of same vein as the Goyfs, folks have been experimenting with Tameo in assorted blue shells. White of the Reliquary has found a home in Cradle Control and in some Maverick lists, and I'm sure that we'll see more MH3 cards finding homes, but this is by no means an exhaustive list of what we've already seen see play. I promised to talk about the BNR update, so let's do that. I want to have a quick discussion about Dimir Scaminator and Orcish Bowmasters. I didn't expect that Orcish Bowmasters would see such a huge drop in play rate, but that's what we're seeing. Prior to MH3, Orcish Bowmasters was seeing play in roughly 40% of decks. It's down to sub 30%, and this trend actually began prior to the release of MH3. Due to the saturation of Dimir Scaminator, many pilots began to swap them out for Dauthi Voidwalker, likely as a tool to gain advantage in the mirror matches. Psychic Frog has become the 2-drop of choice for Dimir Scaminator and Grixis Delver and Classic Scam, replacing Bowmasters or Dauthi, with Bowmasters being relegated to a sideboard card and a tool for non-blue decks. I did do a metagame analysis of the time frame from the sticker ban until the release of MH3, but I never released it because I had a lot of real life stuff going on. My findings from that period were that Dimir Scaminator was heavily dominant. During that time period, Dimir Scaminator was 17% of the Challenge 32 results and had a conversion rate to X2 of 45.7% compared to an expected rate of 33%. This is an overperformance of roughly plus 40% relative performance to expected performance. Currently, Dimir Scaminator has a field saturation of 19.5% with a conversion rate of 46.5%, compared to an expected 32.5% conversion rate, an overperformance of plus 42.75% relative to expected. While we don't necessarily have a concrete objective threshold at which action should be taken, I think that this is over the threshold at which I personally think this is acceptable. I'm not entirely sure what card should be the card that sees a ban, but I think it should probably be Grief. Dimir Scam and Dimir Scaminator make up a total of 27% of the field right now, with Grief being the core of both decks. Grief is also undoubtedly the card that leads to the least enjoyable play patterns. Other possibilities for an axe could be Orcish Bowmasters or Psychic Frog, or I guess even Dauthi, but I'm not convinced that any of these would actually have an impact on the saturation or success of Dimir Scam or Scaminator. If Frog, Bowmasters, or Dauthi were to be banned, the deck would just switch to one of the other 2-drops and I think maintain its dominance. The other cards that could be hit here are Entomb or possibly Reanimate, but outside of Fair Shells, I like these cards a lot as cards in the format. Entomb enables cool Echo of Eons synergies. Reanimate is a core component of Reanimator decks, which are a fan favorite. Entomb was on the ban list at one point and has only really been pushed over the edge once it was included in Scaminator. I don't have a clear answer on what I think action should be taken, but I do think action should be taken. This is a different opinion from what I've said in the past, or the belief that I've held in the past, but it is important to adjust perspectives when facts on the ground change. At the time, Dimir Scamander was a much newer deck, and it hadn't yet been stable at this level of metagame saturation and success for, I don't know, coming on 3 months at this point. To close out, I want to share a list that took second place in the Challenge 64 on June 16th, played by Daganev, who I hope is watching this. Congrats on the finish, Diego. It's a Sultai Scam deck, including Psychic Frog and Orcish Bowmasters. It has a moderate land denial package of 2 Stifle, a Loam, and a Witherbloom command to support the playset of Wastelands. Uro and Grist both provide a strong long game engine to gain advantage in fair matchups. This looks like a strong list that has some big upsides in the metagame right now, and I think that Sultai Scam likely has solid game against many of the top decks. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed and got something useful out of this. Please let me know in the comments what you think of MH3 and Legacy so far, and how you feel we should address and advocate for our format in terms of the ban list. Also, feedback on my work is always appreciated. Let me know what I can be doing better, or what stuff you like about what I'm doing. As of today, deck lists for MTGO are down for the foreseeable future. Apparently this has something to do with an API that let people scrape all the Magic Online results from all events, but I don't really know any details there. So I don't have any data from Friday, June 21st onwards, and we'll see what data looks like and what WotC decides to do. I'm sure that Joe Dyer at MTG Goldfish, alongside the Legacy data collection folks, will continue the good work without WotC providing the deck lists, but that's outside of the scope of what I have time or the ability to do. Depending on how WotC decides to proceed with decklist and results publication in the future, my future of metagame analysis is kind of unclear. In the meantime, check out my Soul Land video if you want to learn more about Legacy, and subscribe if you want to see more. I may decide to revamp my Scam video and re-release it now that we have Grief until at least mid-August, and the metagame has adjusted somewhat from the time that I released the every Scam deck and Legacy video. So let me know if that's something you'd like to see, or if there's a more specific sub-focus of Scam that you'd like me to focus on there.